Good evening and welcome to the Australian Roundtable Podcast, coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. It's Sunday the 5th of October. This is our first official podcast. I'm your co-host Johnno, and I've got with me here in the studio today Ethan of TOTT News. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, everyone.
Now, Ethan, we have a lot to get through tonight. The last few weeks have seen a lot of things transpire here and abroad. In our domestic segment tonight, we're looking at the laws that have been passed through the Australian Parliament regarding supposed anti-terrorism legislation. We've got the Numan Haider incident down in southeastern Victoria. We've got the Burqa business that's been taking place, the debate surrounding burqas in Parliament. We've got Facebook censorship, which I know that you know a fair bit about. And of course, Australia has declared that we're going to war in Iraq. Then in international news tonight, we'll be looking at that Iraq war and where we think that might be headed. The protests in Hong Kong. David Cameron's very, very concerning speech to the UN a week or so ago. The fifth beheading supposedly taken place at the hands of ISIS. This Ebola incident. And maybe we'll look at some of the things to do with the Georgia Guidestones as well. Then in our Around the Net segment, we'll talk about some of the censorship that's taking place in the alternative news segment. And then we'll conclude with some final thoughts. But before we get into any of that other stuff, Ethan, we'll get straight to the business with the anti-terrorism legislation. Now, let's just run through what's happened over the last week or two. On Thursday, August 21, Tony Abbott announced that these beheadings that could take place in the Middle East might take place here in Australia. Fast forward to where we are today. And I know that you have plenty of information about the laws that have passed our Parliament just in the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, definitely. As most may know, this past Wednesday, the National Security Legislation Amendment Number 1 Bill 2014 just passed the House of Representatives after it had passed the Senate last week with a 42-12 vote in the Senate. Pretty overwhelming, but they passed the House of Representatives this past week, and you know me, Johnno, I've been out in the street getting any interview I can, being as vocal as I can throughout my website and through my YouTube channel, trying to speak about these laws because they are very, very concerning and very important. So I'm just going to go through the legislation that just passed on Wednesday, to tell you some of the key points that are under it. There's 3 key points that are under this legislative bill that I find very concerning. And the first one is the way that ASIO has justified protection under this is under special intelligence operations. And this is what the whole basis of the legislation will be found under. So the first point under this is that if anyone, a journalist or a whistleblower or anyone of the public, reveals the name of an agent or an ASIO agent or speaks or reveals information either deliberately or inadvertently through Facebook or whatnot, sharing an article that is a special intelligence operation, which, by the way, is declared and justified by them themselves. They are the ones who are able to decide what an SIO is. Anyone who shares information about an SIO can face 5 years in prison, and if it affects the health and or security of the public, they can face another 5 years in jail, which in most cases it probably would. So they're looking at facing 10 years in prison for releasing sensitive information like this. And what the problem with this is that it could completely eradicate any reporting on national security from journalists. And this is a major concern because the only way we found out about the bug in the East Timor cabinet meeting, the only way we've found out about any of these incidents that is happening is through journalists reporting on national security from sensitive information. So if this comes through, starts to be implemented within society now that the law is passed, then that makes a real concern about that. And if national security reporting starts to disappear, it gives ASIO and other special intelligence operatives, which also include any affiliates, any subcontractors, anyone that is associated or affiliated with these operations, that it gives them the license to completely run free. And with the other points that are in this legislation...
Before we go on to other points there, Ethan, sorry to interrupt, let's point out that when you talk about SIOs, you're talking about special intelligence operations. And ASIO get to declare which operations qualify under that criteria. So essentially, it might be your understanding, because you've looked into this further than I have, that they could essentially declare anything that they're doing as being a special intelligence operation, and then a journalist or any whistleblower, or perhaps even people like us, we can't discuss it publicly, or else we risk being sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Is that the way that you interpret what's happened?
Yeah, definitely. That's the concern that a lot of the senators that oppose this bill have been saying in the parliament, because it pretty much puts a gag order on anyone that tries to even reveal any information about what's happening with these security intelligence operations, because they can declare anything as a security intelligence operation. They try to justify it by saying that they have to go through their monitors and their regulators that do it, but as history has shown us, that their monitors and regulators are pretty much non-existent, and pretty much it just gives them a free-for-all.
Essentially what we're saying is that Australia's Security Intelligence Organisation, that is the acronym I think, can basically do whatever they want and say no one can report on this or talk. If you take a step back from it, this is genuinely draconian and scary legislation that's just passed through our parliament.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's absolutely a terrifying bill. And that's just the first point of the bill. The second, those two...
I've already heard enough.
Those two... those were the first two that relate to each other, because the second part that actually relates to this is that ASIO, under this new bill, are now exempt from civil or criminal liability when partaking in special intelligence operations. So, Johnno, not only can we not report on it, not only can they justify what it is, if somehow it does get out, or if somehow they've done something illegal under it, they're civilly and criminally exempt, as long as it doesn't cause death, if it doesn't cause physical harm, or if it doesn't have any sexual relation, whether it be a sexual assault, etc. So they've become completely above the law, essentially, under these SIOs, and nobody is allowed to speak of it. What do you think about this?
Well, I guess have a bit of a thought experiment here. We're going to start taking these shows live as of next week. This is a recording, but this is a podcast. But as of next week, we're going to do the podcast and record live. So hypothetically, if we're recording a live show and they decide to raid the studio here for whatever purpose, if we were to broadcast live on it, hey, they're raiding us, and this happened to be an SIO, we're liable for broadcasting that to 5 or 10 years in prison. But they are not liable for any damage that they do to my house or anything, because they are immune to civil and criminal prosecution.
Yeah. That's a fantastic example there. He just summed those 2 points up in a nutshell. Johnno absolutely nailed it on the head right there. It's really it's just unbelievable. And some people may recall earlier this year, WikiLeaks released an affidavit from a court talking about Australian politicians being involved in, sending fake money to international countries, and there was a gag order on the media over here, and people sharing it on social media, the direct link to the WikiLeaks site, were, told that this is, you can also be liable under this because, we've put a gag order and you can't share this. Now this law pretty much is the exact same thing, to put it in perspective, but for essentially anything that they can do. And not only are they exempt from criminal liability, their increase in powers to spy on us has also increased. And this is the third point under the legislation. There's no longer a warrant. There's no longer a cap on the amount of devices that ASIO can tap with a single warrant. So previously they had to warrant your phone, they had to get a single warrant for your phone, a single warrant for your computer. Each device required a warrant. Under this, say they put a warrant out against you, Johnno, they can then bug everything within your life that they suspect, anything that you, wherever you travel, wherever you go, any office that you may be in, anything in your life, there's no cap to the amount of devices they can tap. And the concern from this is that under the legislation, they've changed the definition of computer to refer to a network. And under this, if a network is monitored, then in Australia there is a collaborative effort of a network of networks. This is how the internet works within Australia. And essentially what people like Senator Scott Ludlam was standing there saying, Attorney General, does this mean essentially that the entire internet in Australia could be monitored? And then obviously there was blatant, because I watched the Senate debates, there was just complete, just dividing and, just brushing the questions off like they were nothing, and he was not cooperating at all, but basically said, yes, that's exactly what's going to be happening, and could happen if this gets out of hand. So the very first law with these 3 points, not only are ASIO exempt from civil and criminal liabilities under these so-called special intelligence operations, which can network to thousands of people under their subcontractors and affiliates, that they could declare for anything that they do. Not only are they criminally and civilly exempt from this, not only do they now have the ability to monitor everything within a person's life or the entire Australian internet, but anyone who tries to even speak out or discuss this or try to report on these happenings faces 10 years in jail. So, Johnno, that's the first bill that's passed, and it's absolutely terrifying in my opinion. What do you think?
Do they have YouTube in prison? Yeah, look, I've been following this, as you know, and I think if someone was sitting here today in Australia and they weren't here 2 years ago and they heard everything that you just said, they'd be asking, well, how could this have happened? What has precipitated the requirement to give ASIO such incredible powers to the point where not only can they do whatever they want, but just by reporting on what they're doing, you risk 5 or 10 years in prison? Because that's what we're talking about here. How could this have happened? But let's go through the timeline, going back to the James Foley beheading, which occurred in about the middle of August. I think August 19. This was the US journalist who was beheaded supposedly by ISIS in the Middle East. It made worldwide news, particularly in the West. A couple of days later, Tony Abbott said, and this is a quote, "It could happen in countries like Australia if we relax our vigilance against terrorism and potential terrorism. This is why we need new legislation to strengthen the powers of our security agencies to make it easier to detain and jail people," end quote. That was August 21. Now, on September 12, a few weeks later, Australia's terror alert was raised from medium to high. It had been medium for about a decade, and it was suddenly raised to high, which by the Australian government's own definition means that an attack is likely. Despite that, Abbott said that they had no specific intelligence that something was going to happen. 6 days later, on September 18, we had those massive terror raids where something like 800 AFP and other officers raided dozens of houses throughout Sydney and Brisbane. They arrested, a handful of people, and I think last I heard maybe 1 or 2 had actually been charged with anything. But that had dominated the mainstream news in Australia, particularly the newspapers and the 6pm bulletins, and got a lot of people scared. 4 days after that, on Monday, September 22, Abbott said to Parliament, and I'll give you another quote here. This is a quote. "For some time to come, Australians will have to endure more security than we are used to, and more inconvenience than we would like. For some time to come, the delicate balance between freedom and security may have to shift. There may be restrictions on some so that there can be more protection for others. After all, the most basic freedom of all is the freedom to walk the streets unharmed and sleep safe in our beds at night." End quote. I mean,
unbelievable.
We could sit here and pick this apart and laugh about it, all night. But the sad thing is, it gets worse. The day following that speech to Parliament by Abbott, we had the Numan Haider incident, where an 18-year-old man in southeastern Melbourne was shot dead at a police station, allegedly after he attacked them with knives. Now, I want to talk more about that incident later, so we'll come back to that soon. 2 days after that, the legislation that you're talking about, the National Security Legislation Amendment Bill number 1, 2014, passed the Senate, and obviously it passed the lower house a few days subsequent to that. And it's this little thing in brackets that scared me when I read about this, doing the research for the show. The National Security Legislation Amendment Bill number 1, 2014. Now, am I right in inferring that you've got information about other bills?
Yes.
I don't want to hear about it, but go on, please. Tell me what else have we got coming?
Yes, well, that's just the beginning, unfortunately. Everything that we've just discussed is just the beginning, because there is 2 more bills on the way by the end of the year, which is only, 2.5 months before the end of the year. There's 2 more bills that are coming, which also restrict our freedoms even more, that have been in the works for, in some cases, a number of years. The second one that is coming, that I'll get into now, is the amendment to the counter-terrorism legislation amendment, Foreign Fighters Bill, which was presented into Parliament on the 24th of September. It was introduced, and it creates new offences for, quote, advocating terrorism. And we'll talk about how that relates once we analyse the David Cameron speech, but that's very concerning there. And also stops people from entering a declared zone, a declared war zone, that they that we already know of cases of them cancelling passports for people trying to head over to conflict zones such as Syria. So this bill is going to really address that and really focus on stopping people from travelling legally. And it's going to be the catalyst to allow preemptive detention to continue on past the Howard 2005 introduced bill. This is the amendment to it. It was set to expire next year, and it's going to continue on now with the second bill that's going to be introduced. So I'll just run down what things under this bill and are more concerning. Obviously, I've talked about restricting from travelling to war zones, but the real thing I want to concentrate on is here domestically, and how they are trying to prevent people here from spreading terrorist propaganda or trying to commit an act of terrorism. And that's the concerning part, because it's a very broadened spectrum. So I'm just going to talk about what it does. It's essentially restricting the freedoms and movements and associations of people. So it broadens the range of circumstances where control orders can be sought. And control orders are the orders that are sent for people to be preemptively detained. Currently, you can be preemptively detained for 14 days. The Australian Federal Police implemented this with the raids that happened with the approximate 800 police. So you can be detained for 14 days without charge. It enforces now the expansion, or the amendments to this bill now talk about the orders that happen after you're released. And this is the troubling part. It wants to enforce a 12-hour curfew for people to stay in a current location in any given 24-hour period. So once you're released, they can have an order on you to say you must remain in your house for 12 hours per day. You must not travel to this. You must, you can't go this place. You can't go this place between these certain hours, because you're suspected of committing terrorism, or we want to keep you under monitor. It applies. The application for a detention order has now been downgraded from a belief to a suspicion. Police can now preemptively detain you on a suspicion, just as they can on the street search you if they suspect you may have something, or suspect and as most people know, that's a very broadened term. So from a solid belief has now been degraded to a suspicion to be preemptively detained.
So basically, they don't have enough evidence to charge you or to keep you under detention, but they can give you a curfew to say where you can and can't go.
Yes. So you stay in your house whilst ASIO are monitoring your internet activities. It's just, you couldn't even make this stuff up.
The scary thing for me is, when I was a teenager, I never had a curfew. It was just, don't do anything stupid and come home whenever you like. If I got given an ASIO curfew, it'd literally be the first curfew I've ever had. I'm not looking forward to it. It's
really unbelievable. So they can detain you on a suspicion now, preemptively detain you for 14 days, and then when you come out, sort control orders for any 12-hour period.
So to recap on what you've said so far, because there's more to come, we're at the point now where you can be detained without charge for up to 14 days. You can be placed on a curfew for up to 12 hours, I think you said.
Yep.
And the bodies that can do this, like ASIO, anybody who seeks to report on them wants to make sure they're reporting on something that hasn't been declared a special intelligence operation, because if it is, they're liable to 5 to 10 years imprisonment. And we're not talking about conspiracy theories here. We're not talking about what we're afraid is going to happen. You're talking about legislation that has been passed our parliament, or has been tabled in the same parliament, and with our two major parties both supporting all of this draconian nonsense, will eventually pass.
Yes.
In Australia today in 2014.
Yeah, that's...
And I can see you've got notes in front of you. There's more to come, isn't there?
Yeah, there's more to come. I've read through all three of these bills, and I've made the notes here because I want to talk about it because it's absolutely unbelievable. Continuing on with this law, now these orders for you to be arrested and orders to be monitored or curfewed or whatnot once you're released can now be made electronically or verbally by the superiors to the police that are going to enforce this, even if details such as the person's name or who they are not even known at the time. If it's urgent and the police suspect that you're going to commit an act of terrorism, all they need is a verbal, okay, thumbs up from their superiors to do that. This is unprecedented in this country because, it's unbelievable because electronically as well, it can be sent through email, it can be sent, through a text message. It's the verbal part is the most troubling because on an urgent thing, just ring up. I suspect this is happening. Previously, obviously, it had to go through the levels of approval that had to be done through the superiors, through documents, through through all sorts of methods to approve something to happen. Now it can just be straight away if it's suspected of being an urgent thing. So that's the final point from this legislation. Not only can you now be verbally approved to be picked up on a suspicion of committing a terrorist act, then preemptively detained for 14 days without a charge, then you can be released, and another one of these verbal orders can be made to keep you in your house with 12 hours on a curfew and monitor who you associate with and, tell you can't associate with people. And if you try to, as we've said, it ties into the first bill where as you try to report on some of these special intelligence operations or talk about how ASIO is pretty much enforcing and running wild, you can face 10 years in prison. So that's the second bill. This is the second bill that's passing, and it's unbelievable. It's just, what do you think of that, Johnno?
Well, is that... So we've talked about the one that has been passed, and now you've just finished talking about one that's been tabled.
Yeah. Is
it just the two that we know of so far, or have you got a third one as well?
There's a third one coming.
Well, hey, let's get all the bad news out of the way.
And this, I'll just go quickly through this one. It's the dreaded data retention scheme that has been in the table for the past 2.5 years. On TOTTnews.com, we've been following this really, really heavy, and we thought it was dead and buried, but now because ISIS are around every corner, it's been resurrected into going to be presented again based on recommendations, and it's coming back, Johnno. It's coming back, the data retention scheme.
Well, I guess, look, some of our listeners might be wondering, why is it that Ethan is so across all of these bills and Johnno seems less well across them? The reason is because many of us have suspected that they've had these powers to do this unofficially for decades. The powers and the ability to do this for decades, to spy on individuals and to collect data. And I guess the formalisation of this and the making it legal and official, to me, it's just a formality. I have suspected long that they have been able to do this and have been doing this for a long time. And I guess there's so much happening in the world that's why I've spent less time delving into the legislation that's been tabled today, because I just see it as a formality. But that's not to say that I don't agree with you at all about the seriousness of this. I mean, it's amazing that, because many people have never believed that they could do this or they would do this, they'd spy on you, spy on an entire network, collect data on what you're web browsing or whatever. Many people have thought, well, they would never do that. I'll worry about it when it happens officially. Well, it is happening officially now.
Yeah. And
those same people who've long said, well, you're wrong, it's not happening, it'll never happen. Well, now that it is officially happening, it just seems like so few people seem to care. So few people seem to know. Yeah. And I think a large reason for that is because for the last month or two, we've just been bombarded by the mainstream media with all of these messages of this death cult ISIS. And we're at the point now where so many people will justify any erosion of their civil liberties because they're so scared of this death cult ISIS that has, so far as we know, done nothing in this country whatsoever.
Yeah.
We'll get to Numan Haider in just a moment and I'll discuss what's happened there. But the the legislation you're talking about is genuinely very scary. And when you look at the time on how we got here, I think the average Australian of 5 or 10 years ago would think that this is crazy. But the truth is, apart from people like you and me, the majority of Australians don't seem anywhere near as fussed about the erosion of liberties as a sensible person might think they might be.
Yep, and you just spoke on that. You just spoke on that pretty thoroughly. The problem is, it's happening now. These are being presented now, and it's becoming legal. And once it becomes legal, then it's in trouble then. And this third bill is the data retention scheme. For those that don't know, they want to store and control all of the metadata, which is your internet, your emails, your phone calls, pretty much everything that's done electronically, your history, anything that you do. They want to store each and every citizen in this country's metadata for 2 years. And obviously they're going to have to build data, they're going to have to build more data facilities that they have. They want to build more, places to store this, because it's going to be an enormous amount of data. And the troubling part about this is we're a part of the Five Eyes Alliance, which is, a collaborative effort between the United Kingdom, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, where they share metadata amongst one another. And ASIO, as you mentioned, they've been... Any government agency in this country can request data without a warrant. There was over 300,000 requests in the last year alone, just by people like Centrelink, people like Medicare have just been requesting this, and there's no monitor for it already. And now they're just going to take it and store it and do whatever they want with it. And it's a really concerning thing. These are the 3 bills that are here, and it's absolutely unbelievable. And it's all been driven because of this, fake terror threat. And I like to put this to people that want to believe mainstream narrative and talk about how we do have to shift the delicate, the delicate leveling between freedom and security. I want to talk about how if ISIS is so bad, and if ISIS have an ideology that's skewed of the worldview, and they hate our freedom, haven't they won if our freedoms are then taken from us? Don't they win in the end, because we are giving up our freedoms to fight them, the very freedoms and security that they hated, the very system that they hated in the first place is now being altered to fight them. So I like to pose that question to you.
Well, look, I've got an opinion poll I want to discuss later on in our domestic segment here, but my question to you, Ethan, is when you speak to people, when you put this very logical statement to them, to the people on the street, what's the response that you typically get?
It doesn't seem to get through to a lot of people. A lot of people like to say, well, I've got nothing to hide, so why I don't have a problem with them spying on everything I do. I've got nothing to hide. We're here to stop terrorists. And it's just unbelievable, because it's not about that. It's about our right to be free sovereign human beings with privacy in this country, and it's completely being eroded from us every single day of the week, Johnno. And it's all based on all of this hearsay nonsense that has been just pumped into us, such as the Numan Haider issue that I think you'd like to talk about now. Just one of the key indicators in this timeline of pumping fear into the people to skew their public opinion of certain events.
Look, it's very important that we cover this Numan Haider incident, and I will be making a specific video and uploading that to my channel in the coming days. I'll have that finished, but for the time being, I'll give a brief rundown of what happened, because I think in the annals of history, those people who are allowed to study Australian history, if any of those people exist in the future, they'll be able to look back to this incident as a seminal point in the final erosion of our civil liberties. And you mentioned the Five Eyes Alliance, and I know that many of our listeners, as we grow the show, will come from the other countries of the Five Eyes, because really this affects us all. And you say that some of the laws that are being passed are unprecedented in Australia. In many cases, my understanding is they're unprecedented in the Western world. In some ways, we're almost like the testing ground for this. And the fact that our citizens have put up almost no fight, no ideological resistance to any of this, it doesn't bode well for our listeners in other countries. This Numan Haider incident is what has seemingly pacified most Australians. And I'll give a brief rundown of what's happened. On September 23, that was a Tuesday at evening, there was an incident that was reported throughout the mainstream press that had allegedly happened about 7:30 that same evening, where a young man at 18 years old had been shot dead by police, having gone there apparently to stab them. Now, the initial reports that came out said that he had been shouting that he wanted to kill Tony Abbott, our Prime Minister, who at the time was overseas. But the official story that came out, the headlines were Muslim extremist threatens to kill Prime Minister shot dead, or words to this effect. Those were the initial reports. In the Daily Telegraph the next day, I'll give you a quote from an article in the major Sydney tabloid. Sydney's our largest city, obviously. Their major tabloid, in an article the next day, they said that, this is a quote from Tony Abbott. So he released a statement within 24 hours somehow. Tony Abbott stated that, obviously this incident indicates that there are people in our community who are capable of very extreme acts. It also indicates that police will be constantly vigilant against people who would do us harm. I think it was in the US at the time when he released that statement. So within 24 hours, we knew that a young man was dead. We were told that he tried to stab the police and then they shot him. We were told that his passport had been cancelled because he was some kind of Muslim extremist supporter. Although they had not charged him with anything, they had apparently searched his house. The mainstream media was flooded with pictures of him supposedly with an Islamic flag, but in those photos he was wearing a balaclava. We weren't given any CCTV footage showing the incident. We weren't told why it was that the police were supposedly interviewing him in the police station. The official story at the time was that they had called him down to the station to discuss the cancellation of his passport, and then he had gone to shake their hands when he'd arrived. And if you read the articles, they're still online. You can still see what the official story was, in the immediate hours following the incident. That he'd gone to shake the officer's hands because it was all very cordial. Then he'd pulled a knife out of somewhere, stabbed them, and then one of them had shot him. Now, straight away, you'd have to ask some questions. Why is he being interviewed in the car park rather than in the police station? How come two trained police officers, including one AFP, Australian Federal Police, so the big daddy officers, if they were dealing with someone who was considered a terrorism threat to the point where his passport had been cancelled, we were told that he'd been being monitored for months, how could they have put themselves in a position where he could suddenly stab them, two of them, before they were able to defend themselves? Questions like this weren't answered at the time, and in the weeks subsequent to this, no one in our mainstream media was asking these questions. It was just, Numan Haider was a bad person, he was a troubled person, he wanted to kill. The story became that he had gone to the police station to behead people, which opens more questions. If he genuinely wanted to behead people, why on earth would he go to a police station filled with people with guns? I mean, if they said that he was intent on beheading people. Okay, if he was, why would we go and try and behead the hardest people on the planet in Australia to behead, the armed people? It's just a ridiculous story. And for me, what troubled me was that no one else was questioning this. There were some people online who I saw who were questioning a few things, but for the most part, people just accepted this whole story hook, line and sinker. Where it gets worse is that just in the last few days, the coronial inquiry into the death, because they are putting a coronial inquiry into it, took place. The coronial investigation, the directions hearing at the coroner's court. The new official story, which was given to this coronial inquiry on Friday, just a couple of days ago, October 3, was that the police officers saw him in the car park next to the police station. They went over to conduct a search on him. When they saw that his hand was in his pocket, they asked him to remove his hand to conduct the search. Then he suddenly pulled out the knife and conducted a frenzied attack on them. He stabbed one of the officers very seriously injured them, stabbed the other officer in the arm. The officer who was stabbed only in the arm managed to shoot him dead with one shot while he sat atop the other officer who he was supposedly killing with the knife. Then the officer who had shot him dead stayed with him with the gun pointed while the seriously injured officer ran into the police station to call for help. That's the official story. Now, I'm hoping that many of our listeners will be sitting there going, that can't be the official story. That sounds ludicrous. That is the official story as of Friday. So not only was the first official story just filled with question marks, it's gotten worse since. Not only has the story changed, but it's still absurd. Now we're told that this will come back, because these investigations take a long time, that this will next go to court early next year. And in the meantime, they will collect the CCTV footage. And hopefully, if all of this story is true, which it might well be, they'll release evidence to verify this. In the meantime, this story has been used to justify the erosion of our civil liberties and Australia sending troops to Iraq, which we'll get into further detail in our international segment. If you want proof that this Haider incident is being used as a way to justify our invasion of Iraq, take note of this. Australia's official commitment to sending planes to bomb ISIS in Iraq was made on Friday, October 3, the same day as this coronial investigation had its day in court. Now, some people might say that's a coincidence, and that's fine. As you can probably imagine, Ethan, I don't subscribe to that theory. Based on what you've just heard from me, what do you think?
Yeah, well, you obviously mentioned, and it's easy to tell straight off the bat that there's just major inconsistencies with both stories. There's major questions that need to be asked. And the only thing that I obviously heard from the mainstream media throughout the week was obviously no questions. But one thing I'd like to say is I watched Andrew Bolt. Andrew Bolt was...
So for our viewers at home who might not be familiar, Andrew Bolt is employed by News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, as their lead blogger and journalist in their Melbourne masthead, the Herald Sun. And he's also got his own show on Channel 10 because Channel 10, one of our most wealthy people, probably our wealthiest person, Gina Reinhart, bought a stake in Channel 10, got a say in their programming, and all of a sudden Bolt had his own Bill O'Reilly-like show on a Sunday morning. That's the Andrew Bolt that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's the exact show I've seen it on, and all he did was conduct a segment talking about how Australia gave that boy so much. He said that we gave this boy an education. We gave him a country to live in, that's safe, that's devoid of any, threats to them. And, he's continued to subscribe to this Islamic, thing, this Islamic ideology. He continued to plot, even though he was, under watch, even though he had his passport cancelled, and still, cunningly planned to go and behead, members of the public, and decided to attack these police just out of his general hatred that had spawned. It was just absolutely... Andrew Bolt was going on and on, following the first official story, the first official story that you said the mainstream media was running with. Andrew Bolt ran with that on his show and just said that we gave this boy so much, and yet... the ideologies of a person that's an Islamic extremist can't even be changed by even the simplest of freedoms in this country. And he said that it's a testament to why we should have greater security and why our freedoms should be eroded. So that's all the mainstream media reporting on this issue, Johnno. Yeah. And people aren't questioning this, and you've actually looked into the actual inquiry into it, and it's a completely different story.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is if you look at the front pages of the tabloids, across Australia, in the past few weeks, it has been relentless. It's been a relentless onslaught of ISIS terror, death cult, Haider wanted to behead, so on and so forth, to the point where you can't have a logical conversation with someone about this. Right now, the only evidence that we have that Haider had attempted to behead these officers is the testimony that's been given to us by the police, by our government, and by the mainstream media. Now, we have to bear in mind that only a decade or so ago, we were told that, for just one example of how they can and do lie to us all the time, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that at any minute we could die of anthrax. Again, back then, I remember this well, all of our tabloids and all of our 6pm bulletins were saying that there was an existential threat and, we were about to be killed and blah, blah, blah. It turned out to be a complete lie. So when I say to people, hey, hold on, an 18-year-old man is dead, shot dead by the police, no evidence has been released as yet to confirm any of their story. Their own story has already changed. Maybe there's more to this than we're being told.
Just maybe.
I'm not even asking people to believe that this is all a big conspiracy or anything like that. Let's just ask why the official story has so many holes and why we've been told so much negative stuff about this young man, but not a single piece of evidence has been released to verify any of what we're told about the police killing him. And this is what's really, over the last week or two, I guess, concerned me, is that all they've had to do is say that Haider was an Islamic extremist or a sympathiser, That's all they've had to say, and people have gone, well, that's fair enough, he's dead.
Yeah.
That's all we needed to know. The police killed him, fantastic. And you can see comments to this effect on online news articles and on internet forums. That's all it takes now. So I genuinely believe that if for whatever reason they decided that they want Joe Blow of one fake street, St. Lucia dead, for argument's sake, they could shoot him dead, and so long as they tell the world, well, he had an Islamic flag at home, that seems to be all they'd have to say. And all of Joe Blow's neighbours and community and the rest of his country, they're not going to say, well, hold on, why is he dead? Why the police? That's it. That's all they need to be told. The population here has been so scared to the point of losing the ability to think rationally.
Yeah.
And look, it could well be that this Numan Haider did stab these police officers. They did, for whatever reason, put themselves in immediate danger from a person. I mean, the Joint Counter-Terrorism Task Force had been monitoring the teenager, that's the Numan Haider person, for a number of months. So a person who they had been following for a number of months, if they had determined that he was a threat, maybe these two officers were foolish enough to put themselves within stabbing distance of the person in a child centre car park. Maybe that is true. I'm not saying it's not. Maybe all of their story is true. But the fact that nobody's questioning it, for me, very few people are questioning it. For me, this is the most concerning element of the whole thing. We've lost our sense of community. We've been so easily divided. It's scary. I'll be honest, it's scary. And
this story is just one example of a testament. Is a testament to the entire timeline that has begun since ASIO raised the level of the terrorism threat too high. Everything that's happened has been based on hearsay threats and or loosely based evidence to justify any action to take against anything. There's just been an onslaught to the public of just fear, propaganda, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, is the only thing I'm being told by the mainstream media. And people are generally terrified seeing these headlines. People are generally terrified because the media does have that distortive effect where, as you said, people don't think rationally, people think out of fear and emotion. And because of that, they are just running wild with any justification they can to continue on with eroding our liberties and whatnot.
You and I have discussed before this whole terrorism threat alert, which was introduced by the Australian government following the September 11 attacks, where the Australian government had an official level of terror that the citizens should consider. And it was at medium up until recently, as we discussed before. Then it was raised to high. Now, when it was raised to high a few weeks ago, our Prime Minister said that this shouldn't change our behaviour. We shouldn't change our behaviour about it. So the smart person has to ask the question, if we're not supposed to change our behaviour, what purpose does having a terror alert raised to high serve? Yeah. It would seem that the only purpose it serves is to make us more terrified.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. That's a fantastic point.
That's all that it does. And once you realise what's going on here, it's a blatant psyop. There's no doubt about that. And our fellow Australians have been scared witless by this ISIS incident. Which leads to the next thing I wanted to talk about here in this domestic segment, which is the question of the burqa. Now, as a background for our listeners, just in the last week or two, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not we should ban the burqa in this country. Obviously, in some countries in Europe, like France, it has been banned. And it reached, a crescendo this week when people were banned from wearing the burqa when attending Parliament to sit in the watching seats. You can go to Parliament and watch what happens there. And people who were wearing burqas were banned from doing so. They had to sit in a separate area, which just drummed up more of this debate about burqas. Now, I know that you've been following the social media conversation about this. What have you noticed?
One thing I've noticed throughout this whole ordeal, which it's what it is. It's an ordeal. It's a psychological ordeal that the public are going through with this propaganda. First off, personally, I know people that do wear burqas, which isn't even the correct name for the head pieces that these individuals are wearing. There's a whole range of different names, and the burqa is not even the one that Tony Abbott is supposedly finds confronting. So he's contradicted himself there. But online, obviously, this has been used as a catalyst to divide us amongst each other, divide the Muslim community amongst, the rest of the community, because every Muslim's a terrorist, according to the mainstream media. But online, I see it's about 50-50 at the moment. I think it's about 50% of the public are awake, but 50%, are still in the mentality of, that their subconscious has been constructed for them to, say what, believe what they think. But online, any alternative view is being completely cut out of major mainstream sites. Channel 9 News, the Sunrise's page, all of these pages that are discussing issues such as the Burqa, such as, Muslims in the community, such as terrorism. People that comment on this with even constructive criticism, saying, hey, they lied to us about weapons of mass destruction, hey, they did this, hey, there's a history of the government lying to us, and we need to focus on the real enemy and not be divided amongst ourselves. These pages are deleting they're deleting most of the comments that are saying these things, whilst keeping the hater, the ones that are hating, the ones that are saying that all Muslims are terrorists and that we should go to war and wipe them off the face of the planet. All of these things are being kept there, and it's unbelievable, because it's hard to combat. Not only from one focal point, as we've seen, they're pumping us full of propaganda and pumping us full of this, molding us to not question anything and just believe the official narrative. But now anyone that does question it online, whether it be Facebook or internet forums, is either being ridiculed or, diverted from the real message, or it's just being completely deleted. And this is a really troubling thing, because we're a society where you can't question, a society where, your ability to refuse anything that the state says to you, refuse, a free choice, whether it be an intellectual choice or a physical choice to question, is being eroded. That's a serious problem, Johnno.
It is, and obviously you follow social media more than I do for various reasons, and when you told me before we recorded tonight's program that you'd seen this censorship taking place, where people's comments questioning the official narrative were being deleted, that didn't surprise me one bit. I do want to say, to try and be a bit more positive, I talk to people on the street, and it seems that most people have gobbled up this fear-mongering propaganda, but there is some hope out there, because sometimes I'll, whether I'm going through the supermarket chatting with the checkout person, or I'm just waiting for a bus and I chat with the person next to me, I love to canvass people's opinions, and I have had a number of people say to me, yeah, mate, I think this is all bullshit. But the official polling, which I noticed just this morning on Insiders, which is broadcast on our Australian Broadcasting Corporation, our national broadcaster, they mentioned that a Gallup poll came out recently which said that 63% of Australians support Australia, along with its allies, bombing ISIS in Iraq. Now that's almost 2 out of 3 people supporting us going back to the Middle East to bomb people when we only left a few years ago following a war which seems to have made things worse. So all they've had to do is bombard the people with nonsense propaganda for a couple of months, and there are still plenty of people out there who know this is nonsense, but all they need is the majority to go along with this, and at least according to this Gallup poll, the majority of people are going along with this nonsense. What do you make of that?
I think, it's unbelievable. It's just, and obviously, there is a large majority in the public that do eat up this, and some of my friends that are Muslims have described to me, I've got a very a close person to me called Sonia. She wears a headpiece, and her friends go to the supermarket, and they're being spit on by people. They're being, just terrorized, saying that you're a terrorist, going to, blow up everything and whatnot. And this is generally becoming a scary thing. And my heart reaches out to the Muslim community out there that are, desperately trying to get past this notion that all Muslims are terrorists. And it's just unbelievable. And because of all this bombardment, the large majority of the public do support going back to war, because they do believe that there is, a genuine threat, that there is a boogeyman around every corner.
It's incredible, isn't it? These are people whose taxes are going to be used to pay for bombs dropped on people they've never met and will never ever meet, and yet I have heard there's similar reports of spitting or just having a general negative feeling towards Muslims, because they wear a thin bit of cloth over their face.
Yeah.
Now, if you take a step back and ask who's really the terrorist, or who's really doing something morally objectionable, surely it's the people supporting sending planes with bombs to kill people they've never met. And
absolutely.
And this is where they're dividing us so easily. They're getting focused on the trivial, the clothes that we wear, or the buildings that we go to of a Friday, Saturday, or a Sunday. And we're losing sight of a bigger picture, which is that all of these problems in the Middle East, if you look at the history of it, well, every time we go there, we seem to make things worse. But let's not question that. Realistically, though, we are going back, and that makes for a good segue to our international segment. So we might as well get straight into it. On Friday, our Prime Minister Tony Abbott did announce that we're officially sending planes to go and bomb selected targets in Iraq. I know that you've been doing a lot of research into all of this, so please share with us what you've got.
Yep. It's been approved now. The Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott said Australia's going to send 6 FA-18 Super Hornet fighter jets.
Is that all? Only 6?
6 at the moment. to aid the coalition forces of the US and all of these other countries that have joined along for this ISIS threat. In quote, in the interest of civilization, end quote, and the mission over there could be quite lengthy, quote unquote. But he also wanted to affirm that it's not, quote, strictly accurate, end quote, to describe this as a war just yet. It's not a war just yet. We are committing troops to advise Iraqi forces. We are sending bomber planes to drop bombs on suspected ISIS militants, but this isn't a war yet. You may recall, Johnno, that they said that Iraq would last a week and then people would be out, and then 10 years later, people were still over in Iraq. So what do you make of this?
Well, I did notice that the rhetoric has been that this is a humanitarian mission, and it gives you some idea of just what an Orwellian state we are living in right now, where you can send bombs on planes, drop those bombs onto people, and claim that it is a humanitarian mission. And look, most people don't believe that rhetoric, but the fact that a politician even thinks they can get away with that and not be laughed out of the press conference just shows how far we've sunk.
It's absolute madness. It's madness. You couldn't even make this up. You could not make this up.
It takes a lot of chutzpah to even think you can get away with claiming that bombing people is part of humanitarian mission. And I know that some people will say, oh, but they're doing this to save those people trapped on that mountain, which we were told happened 4 or 5 weeks ago on Mount Sinjar. We were told that there were 30,000 refugees trapped and that ISIS were going to kill them. What didn't make the front page news a week or two later was that the number of refugees supposedly that were trapped on that mountain was an order of magnitude less. They weren't really trapped, and I think in the end, a couple dozen US Marines managed to stabilise whatever situation was there. But they will tell us there's 30,000 refugees trapped, and to save them we have to bomb these ISIS fighters. And to some people, this line of argument makes sense, that this is humanitarian.
Yeah, it's absolutely unbelievable. War is peace, ignorance is strength, and freedom is slavery. War, the first one there is a classic example, straight out of George Orwell's 1984. War is peace. We are doing this, Tony Abbott's quoted saying, in the interest of civilization. In the interest of civilization, we have to bomb these ISIS militants. We have to bomb another country. For humanitarian, out of claiming it as a humanitarian issue, we're bombing another country in the interest of civilization. It doesn't get any more Orwellian than that, John.
And in the interests of our own safety, which I noticed that our Defence Minister David Johnston was saying on Insiders this morning, that we have to go on. It's the same as that George Bush rhetoric of, if we don't fight them over here, if we don't fight them over there, we'll have to fight them over here. It's the same nonsense. And at the moment, we know that they're going to put boots on the ground, to use this phraseology that's become popular. We know they're going to do that. At the moment, we're being told by our Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, that we have to wait for permission from the Iraqi government to send the troops. And you have to ask yourself, well, hold on a second. How much permission did we have to send troops there in 2003? It didn't stop us last time. It didn't stop us in the first Gulf War back in 1991. And now here we are in Iraq War Mark III. We're going to wait for permission from the Iraqi government, an Iraqi government that was puppet installed by the US in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, if you actually take a step back and think through what they're saying, it's so absurd. It's almost like they're making it absurd so that anyone who realises how silly it is loses their mind.
I mean, give me the blue pill. But to continue on with the madness, now it's being put back upon us. This erosion of security and, this launching of the war. Joe Hockey has come out.
We should mention is our treasurer, the Treasurer of Australia at the moment.
Yeah, the Australian Treasurer at the moment come out after a horrendous budget with billions of dollars of loopholes within it that are completely unjustified, and it's just completely targeting everyone in this country, whether it be the elderly or students. It's just completely robbing us dry of our pockets.
Well, I can see where you're going with this, Ethan. I hate to interrupt, but this really is worth giving the background. So the coalition government were elected on a platform of fixing our budget, which at the moment is something like $50 billion in deficit in a nation of 24 million people. This is a huge structural deficit in our budget, and they were elected on the platform of fixing that. The first budget they handed down, making cuts to federal spending to try and get the balance back in check, involved a huge slash in welfare, a huge slash in education funding, making students pay more for their education, etc. So it hurt a lot of segments of people who probably couldn't afford to be hurt. That's the background to what you're about to tell us, because I can see where you're going with this.
Yeah, and not only have we been hurt enough from this, not only have, the poor pensioners that have to turn off their heaters because they can't afford the electricity bill been hurt enough from this. Now, Joe Hockey, who is the Treasurer, has come out and said, we need to make more budget cuts for defence and security spending, because they have granted a $630 million boost to security organisations within Australia, and security intelligence organisations, to continue to do the stuff that we've talked about earlier in the show, the spying and the complete Orwellian nightmare. They are being funded even more to do that, and now it's estimated it's going to cost $500 million per year that we are in Iraq doing these quote-unquote humanitarian issues. And now, amongst all of this madness, Joe Hockey has come out and said, we need to make more cuts to pay for this, and it's on you, people. This is all on you. So I just found that that's just the cherry on top of the cake within this whole cycle of just absolute, just onslaught, as I've just put it before, onslaught onto our society as it is, as a structure, on us individually and on us as a society. It's just absolutely unbelievable. Johnno, what do you make of Joe Hockey's comment?
That's what gets me the most when I talk about this issue, is it's your tax dollars that are being spent to bomb these people in the Middle East. It's your tax dollars. Show me a person who pays more tax than they have to. Just show me one person. I want to meet this guy. I want to see what's going through his head. People pay the taxes that they have to pay, right? No one wants to pay them. No one wants to pay as much as they do, that's for sure. And these dollars are being spent to bomb people in the Middle East, money that could be spent on their children's healthcare or their children's education, or on their parents' pharmaceuticals, or what have you. Things that could be spent here are now being spent on bombs in the Middle East. And it couldn't be more clear than when you have the Treasurer standing up and saying, we're going to have to make more cuts to pay for this war, or this humanitarian mission that we're about to go on. And you point this out to people, and you see the cognitive dissonance in their mind. They know this is absurd, but they've already been emotionally sucked into supporting the war, so they're going to reject the new evidence. It's cognitive dissonance 101, and it's, in my experience, it's a lost cause trying to explain to people that they're the ones literally paying for this. They are not the ones paying with their lives. That's the Middle Eastern collateral damage who have to pay for that. But if you don't care about that, okay. Don't you care about your own money? Don't you care that this is where your money's going? Now, okay, we're only sending 6 Super Hornets, which seems like a low number. But a lot of people forget we're spending billions of dollars on the Joint Strike Fighter. I think Tony Abbott just a few months ago signed up to buy even more than we'd originally signed up to.
Yeah.
So of all the nations who are supporting this Joint Strike Fighter project, which, the way it's already over budget and beyond its due completion date, of all the countries who are supporting it, we're at the top. A small little nation of 24 million people has one of the highest orders put in for Joint Strike Fighters. And again, this is all taxpayers' money. And what are those Joint Strike Fighters going to be used for? Well, if they ever start flying, in 10 years they'll be used for Iraq War Mark IV. I mean, it's just a cycle.
It's a cycle, Johnno.
It just goes on and on. I guess if we move on with this Iraq issue, we know that we're back in Iraq. That's official now. The question is, why are we there, and what do you think is the end game? Or where do you think they're headed? Because I think it's not just about Iraq.
No, it's definitely not about Iraq. Just to give some people a bit of a lowdown on what happened, what was trying to be put together at the start of the decade, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, and all of these Middle Eastern countries tried to come together to form some sort of a union to change it from oil being bought with US dollars to make it to be bought with gold. They said, no, United States and Western powers, we control the oil over here, and we want you to buy in gold, no longer in US dollars, which every nation on the planet has to buy within US dollars at the moment. That's the current design that it is. And they were moving to change this because it was obviously affecting them really bad, and it was to try and tip the scale a little bit, to say, hey, America, you're not the major superpower that's going to bully all of us. We are in control of the oil, and we want to sort of regulate and dictate how our oil can be monitored and sent out. And because of this, as we've seen, there's been a move to try and disable any sort of collaborative effort within the Middle East to make a move that threatens the United States or threatens the United States economy. And as soon as this was announced, it was all of a sudden it was time to bring democracy to Iraq. It was time to bring democracy to Libya. Weapons of mass destruction, boom, we're straight in. And I give this background because this is a lot more than just a war against Iraq. Sure, they're using this as a justification to get back into the Middle East, but the Middle East, now they are looking to bring Syria into this, and the US government has approved funding to Syrian rebels, which back during the so-called Libyan and Syrian civil wars, apparent civil wars, ISIS was born out of these wars because there was a group of extremists that the US funded, trained, gave weapons to, and allowed to expand to take down the Libyan and Syrian governments, whilst painting in the mainstream media that they were freedom fighters fighting against, the evil dictators, and they did succeed within Libya with the, Muammar Gaddafi was executed on the back of the car, and Libya, from that, ISIS did expand, but now they are funding Syrian rebels, which in a large majority are ISIS, to fight ISIS within the country. Bear with me here. And it in my estimation, it's being used as a front again to fight Assad and his Syrian government, and to try and collapse that, to try and bring in Iran, which they've been trying to target for a while, to try and take down the remaining remnants of any coalition against the US imperialism or against US control over the oil system. And Johnno, I know you've researched this a lot. I think you understand where Russia plays into this story, and how this could potentially escalate into a much worse situation if they are successful with some of these tactics.
Well, you mentioned earlier what's essentially called the petrodollar, and why these countries are targeted by the US. That's one theory as to why what's taking place is taking place. It's one I'm open to. What is not in debate is that these countries were in the hit list, and there's a video that's available online, anyone can look it up, of General Wesley Clark, a United States general, who says quite candidly that at the time of the 9/11 attacks, or shortly thereafter, he was told very blatantly, very explicitly, that the US was going to go into the following 7 countries. He was told a timeline of 5 years. Obviously, it's been a bit more than that, but these were the 7 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, Syria, and Iran. These are his words. I'm not asking anyone to believe me or even to believe you, Ethan, but this is what General Wesley Clark has said openly, and anyone can check this out. Now, you look at what happened to Iraq and Afghanistan subsequent to what he was told. You look what happened to Somalia and what's happened in Sudan. Look what happened to, as you said, Gaddafi in Libya. Now we've got Bashar al-Assad in Syria is the next person on the hit list. Now, last year we were told that there were chemical weapons that were being used on his own people. The story didn't make sense from the start why he would, of all people, would use chemical weapons on his people when he's desperately in need of support and can't afford to do anything that might get the international world against him. It was later determined that it wasn't him who had used the chemical weapons. It was in fact the other bad guys who many would argue it's clear that the West is backing. So if chemical weapons were being used, it wasn't a start. But we were told that's exactly what happened at the UN. The US wasn't able to get a motion approved to bomb Syria. Russia vetoed that particular motion. And so in the 12 months since, obviously the US has been recalibrating their efforts. And right now, it's clear that what they're going to do is use ISIS as the little leverage to get in and attack Syria. And when you watch our Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, or our Defence Minister, David Johnston, talk about Syria, they're not even really doing much of an effort to hide this. They clearly are quite happy to send our troops into Syria. And while they claim that they want Iraq's permission before they do this, they clearly don't want or need Assad's permission. In fact, Julie Bishop said just a couple of weeks ago that as far as she and the Australian cabinet is concerned, there are large portions of Syria that are ungoverned, her words, and hence you don't need permission from anyone to go and attack. So what is going to happen is the old Hegelian dialectic. It's going to be, hey, look, Australia, we've told you how much we have to bomb, not just Australia, but the whole Western world. We have to bomb ISIS. They're this big bunch of bad guys. You all supported us doing it. We bombed them in Iraq, but look, they all ran into Syria. Whatever can we do? Yeah. And then next thing you know, they'll start bombing in Syria, and it's very clear that the next phase in this little mission is to take out Assad. The big problem that we should all be looking at as citizens of the West is that Syria has a tight defense pact with Iran, and Iran has very important strategic links with Russia. So the more that this goes on, the more obvious it becomes that this could be the start of a much bigger conflict than simply another Gulf War. This could be many orders of magnitude more serious than that. What do you think?
I definitely agree. Obviously, Russia also sells a lot of arms to Syria and have pledged their support to Syria, and I think it could escalate into, if you study history, if you study the causes of World War I, the causes of World War II, the tension in certain regions, the arms race, the instigation, the provocation of certain regions, which led to certain domino effects, which then led to a world war. I think this has the exact catalyst to lead into the next world war. I hope I'm wrong, but all the pieces, if you look through it, this is exactly what they've planned, what they've designed, and what they are trying to do. And Russia's already been demonized because of the MH17 incident. Within the subconscious of the people, everyone hate Russia now because Russia are funding, these terrible rebels within Ukraine, and they, they were thinking of banning Putin from the G20 summit, which is not going to go ahead anymore. But just the demonization of Russia plays a perfect catalyst, plus prior history within the Cold War and whatnot, to demonize Russia as the big bad superpower that is coming in. And so it's if you step back at the bigger picture and you actually research and do a lot of history into it, and actually understand how the Middle East is being used as a chess field for the large superpowers to move their chess pieces, you can see that it's becoming quite clear that this can escalate to a global conflict. Russia obviously have been kept extremely busy with all of these circumstances, and while Russia have been kept busy, then there has been another country that has been kept busy. And Johnno, I think you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about what's happening in Hong Kong. Before we do, just touching on what you said there with the chess pieces, you look at a world map and it's obvious what's happening. Ukraine was destabilized in what was blatantly a CIA mission. There's so much evidence to verify that. One particular piece is that the CIA director, John Brennan, was caught in Kiev following the so-called revolution or coup in Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, I believe is her position, was caught on a phone talking about the puppet that they wanted to install in the new Ukrainian government, Arsenei Yatsenyuk, who then was installed as the new Prime Minister. I mean, it's a blatant coup at the behest of the CIA, right on Russia's doorstep. That's to Russia's west. Then to Russia's southwest, you have this incident in the Middle East with Syria. Again, they're being preoccupied with this. Then, obviously, as part of this grander, I guess, not a formal alliance, but certainly not on the side of the US, is their semi-ally, China. Now, we know that one of the big plans of the US, global strategy is to keep China always fighting to remain as a single state, fomenting civil unrest and its separatist attempts in China to keep the Chinese Communist Party busy with their own domestic affairs, so they can't spend too much time trying to extend their sphere of influence beyond their own borders. Now, in Hong Kong, just in the last week, we've had these massive protests, student demonstrations and what have you, of people demanding a greater right to freedom and to democracy in Hong Kong. And again, if you look into who's leading these protests, it looks like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, two fronts for the US State Department, again have their grubby fingers all over it. And so while our media is telling us that this is great that the Hong Kongese people are fighting for their freedom and protesting for their democratic rights, what they're not mentioning is that once again the US is playing a very underhanded role in all of this, and none of this would come as a surprise to anyone who's studied US history post-World War II. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head, Johnno, and I think it's interesting that Hong Kong has obviously been a very important region throughout history, and a very unique region within the scheme of things, and I think it's playing right into the hands of the West. I think this, it has all the elements of what you just talked about, Johnno. And another thing is that I thought personally, now I don't expect people to agree with this, is that, yeah, sure, being a democracy and being free is good, but think of our democracies and how they've been infiltrated and how they've been completely controlled from the inside to make us believe that we have the illusion that we're free, the illusion that we have choice. Within China, it's blatant. They put who they want on the ballot box. They control a large portion of what happens in everyday life. But part of me thinks that the negative sense of coming off, if the protesters were successful somehow in turning China into democracy, I think it would end up even worse because of the not a dictatorship, but a secret dictatorship, a dictatorship where you were being told that you were free, but we control everything. And I think that's one of the things that's sparked the first time I heard this. Obviously, then I went into, to research it. But I think it's a very interesting situation. It's playing right into the hands of the West, and as we've said, is keeping China, preoccupied, with this event.
Yeah, and to illustrate what you're saying, let's bear in mind what's happening here. We're talking about literally thousands and thousands of demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators in Hong Kong streets, sitting down or standing, some of them with candles or with phones or whatever, essentially doing no harm to anyone. And most people support the idea of having the ability to peacefully protest. If you and I and 100 of our friends decided to go and do the same thing in a Brisbane street here, how long do you think we'd last before we were tased, pepper sprayed and dragged away kicking and screaming? How long do you think we'd last?
Oh.
So, the way I see it, these Hong Kong people are arguing for more freedom and more democracy, when actually the fact that they can even get away with the protests that they're conducting suggests that they probably have, in some elements at least, more freedom than you and I have in a so-called free and democratic country. Remember, bear in mind that both our coalition government and our so-called opposition both support removing all of the civil liberties that we spoke about earlier in the show and going and bombing another foreign country once again. So the notion that our media would tell us how good it is that these people are protesting for their rights, well, hold on a second, what would happen if we did the same thing? They're arguing for freedom that they've already got more than we do. That's the Orwellian world we find ourselves in today.
Yep, and we're being completely demonized. If we went and did that, we'd be completely demonized. We could be, we'd be completely targeted. Just use the Occupy Brisbane movement as an example. They lasted 18 days before they were being dragged out, before they were kicked out, and then, the media attacked them and destroyed their movement within the first couple of days, demonizing them as hippies and everything. And speaking of demonization, I think we should segue into a very important speech that happened within the United Nations.
Nice little segue there, Ethan. I've got here a passage from David Cameron's speech to the UN General Assembly on September 25. David Cameron is, of course, the British Prime Minister. Now, I won't read out all of what he said. I'll link to a video in the info box under the YouTube video that we'll upload, and I'll provide links on our website as well. But I'll give you a quick read of what he said, just the key points. And again, this was September 25, so just over a week ago. To defeat ISIL and organisations like it, we must defeat this ideology in all its forms. Okay, whatever. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by preachers who claim not to encourage violence, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview. He goes on. The peddling of lies that 9/11 was a Jewish plot or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged. The idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world is a deliberate act of Western policy. The concept of an inevitable clash of civilizations. We must be clear. To defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. Now, if you were listening to that, you should have already noticed a few non sequiturs and other logical fallacies in what he said. What's concerning, though, is he's saying that essentially anyone who questions the 9/11 official story, or anyone who questions the 7/7 London attacks as an official story, he's saying that those people who question these things, those people are extremists, and he's trying to paint the picture that they're on par with the Muslim extremists who carry out actual acts of terror. He goes on to say that people, even in universities and schools, should be censored, and then he says, of course, there are some who will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry. But I say, would we sit back and allow right-wing extremists, Nazis or Ku Klux Klansmen to recruit on our universities? No. End quote. So he's not just equating people who question the 9/11 official story, of which there are many millions of people across the world, or the 7/7 London attacks. He's not just equating them with Muslim extremists. He's also saying that they have to be censored. Anyone who questions these things have to be censored because we would censor right-wing extremists, Nazis, or Ku Klux Klansmen. That was the British Prime Minister's speech to the UN just over a week ago. When you first saw that speech or first heard it, what was your reaction, Ethan?
Oh, I was absolutely gobsmacked, Johnno. It was unbelievable. It was absolutely unbelievable. And it's so carefully constructed, that speech. It's carefully constructed because if you go and listen to it, or you've heard what Johnno just said, direct quotes from David Cameron, it's absolutely unbelievable that essentially he is saying that anyone that speaks out against, first he's saying that ISIS support a warped worldview, and that people that question events like 9/11 or the 7/7 bombings, or the fact that all Muslims are being persecuted, as every Muslim is a terrorist. Anyone who supports this also supports a warped worldview, which violent extremism that ISIS conduct and support could prosper in and justified within that world. So essentially, ISIS think that the world is ran a different way. Anyone who questions the systems thinks that things are ran different ways. So we need to also target anyone who questions the system because they are also a threat, just as ISIS is. This is exactly what he's saying in the speech, but it's been carefully constructed with keywords, and we could sit here for an whole episode breaking it down to automatically induce fear into the people, to use their pre-notioned subconscious thinking of how the world is and how every 9/11 conspiracy theorist is a tinfoil hat and how the Ku Klux Klan are bad. Some of these vocal indicators that have been put into the speech to carefully construct it, so we're not thinking out of rational saying, hey, he's telling us anyone who questions the system or thinks free speech is good is bad. No, he's saying, yeah, I completely agree with him, and it's absolutely unbelievable. And I was really threatened. I felt threatened because I think that it's getting to a point where now they're saying, look, we're going to start coming after people that question the system. We're going to start targeting them, and I think it was, to me, the beginning phase of something that could be much, much worse down the track. What did you think, Johnno?
Well, I think we have to keep this in. We have to listen to this speech in the context of what the British government was saying a few weeks ago when these so-called ISIS beheadings first started making their way to the internet. There was major stories in the British press saying that if you were to acquire these videos, supposedly released by ISIS, of these beheadings, that you might be committing a crime under their anti-terrorism legislation. The first so-called ISIS beheading was James Foley on August 19. He was a US citizen. That was followed by Stephen Sotloff, the US. Interestingly, he was also an Israeli citizen as well, on September 2. That was followed by David Haynes on September 13. That was followed by Hervé Gordel, the Frenchman, on September 25. And then, of course, just in the last couple of days on October 3, Alan Henning, another British citizen, was supposedly beheaded by ISIS. So there's 5 ISIS beheading videos that have been released to the internet. What's interesting is that if you do look to find these videos for yourself, if you want to see the evidence before you believe it, because you know not to trust the mainstream media, in none of these videos do they actually show a beheading. Not a single one of these videos shows a beheading. They'll show, the man dressed in black with a knife, and they'll show the supposed beheadee sitting there pleading to the camera, whatever. They don't show any beheading. They don't even show the knife drawing blood from the neck. My question to people is, if you were a terrorist organisation and your intent was to terrorise people, why the hell would you censor out the most terrorising part of your own videos? I mean, we talk about doublethink, we talk about the Orwellian world that we live in. This is doublethink of the highest order, because when I put this question to people, they say to me, oh, well, they didn't want to show people the really graphic part. And I say, okay, why? Why would they do this? Why would they upload it to the internet if they didn't want to scare you? It is absolutely absurd, and I've got no doubt that within the following weeks and months, people like David Cameron are going to come out and say that anybody like me, who even infers, even suggests, even implies that these beheading videos are fake, anybody who does that is an extremist who has to be censored. And they're going to come for us, and I think David Cameron's speech to the UN was a warning to people like yourself and myself, Ethan. People who want to question the prevailing paradigm in the mainstream media, they're going to come after us, which is why I'm enjoying that we're going to be doing this podcast, and let's hope that it lasts at least until G20, which is, of course, in 5 or 6 weeks. Let's hope it lasts that long, but we have to know what's coming. They're forewarning us. They're telling us very clearly, we're coming after you people.
And Johnno, speaking of that, there's been a lot of censorship within alternative media so far. It's already beginning. The beginning phases have already started to take place so far. I know that you follow a number of websites and a number of podcasts and blogs that are, being targeted already, even, before some of this starts to really get bad, in my estimation.
Yeah, well, what we're going to try and do with this show is to have our set domestic segment where we discuss what's happening in Australia, and particularly in Brisbane as the G20 approaches. We want to have our international segment, which will be more accessible to some of our international listeners, people who are part of the alternative truth news movement, if you want to call it that. What I hope we can also do is spend a few minutes each show talking about what's happening in that movement, the alternative truth movement, around the internet. And what has been really concerning in the last week or two is that channels such as Fiji Time on YouTube have been entirely shut down. Channels like Free Radio Revolution, Jeff C., he's on his last warning, and one more strike against his name, which can be completely arbitrary, his channel's going to go down as well. People like Kate Slade and many other of these really excellent researchers who are bringing us the truth, who expose hoaxes like these so-called ISIS beheadings. The people who do this work, they're being threatened, their channels are being censored, their channels are being shut down. And I think as much as I want to have an around the net segment, something tells me over the next few weeks there's not going to be much on the net to talk about because the censorship is going to be all-encompassing. But let's hope that at least with our channel, as long as we don't talk about too many ISIS beheading hoaxes or things like this, they might not shut us down too early.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and we could be on a segment on someone else's show in a couple of weeks talking about, hey, Australian Roundtable was shut down as well, and we can sit and laugh about it, and it's obviously finding light in the situation, but this is a really bad situation that our society has got into. If you've listened from the start of the show, seeing how all of these pieces of the puzzle come together, whether it's silencing of the people, expansion of the powers of the people that are silencing, it's absolute madness, and it's becoming a point where it's getting more and more every day. And now, as online, as I mentioned, with Facebook and other websites, they're continuously censoring anyone that questions the system. David Cameron's now coming out saying anyone who questions the system's a threat, and now established YouTubers that have done nothing wrong, established podcasters that have done nothing wrong on their channel to justify under the guidelines, they are just being completely taken away as well and being silenced. And that's, as I refer back to earlier where I said, where you can't question the system anymore, that's where it gets scary, Johnno, and that's where we need to be concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And there, like I said, there are people out there doing fantastic work. And obviously, with what you're doing with TT News, you're one of the few outlets in Brisbane who are doing this kind of work. We're hoping that this podcast will become part of that. And we're also hoping to inspire more people to do this kind of thing, to talk about what's going on, to do their research, present it to others, encourage more people to do their research. It is, I have to be honest, as I see channel after channel being censored on YouTube, it is a little bit deflating, and you see people like Jeff C who've put so much work into trying to show people the truth of what's going on. When we talk about authoritarian states or totalitarianism, it's not just about the laws that they're passing, which is scary enough on their own. It's also the less obvious stuff. It's also the less blatant stuff, like YouTube, which is essentially a monopoly on the self-news reporting market. Yeah, there are places like Vimeo and these places, but they have almost no market share. YouTube is the big thing. Google Video are the big things. Google owns YouTube, so when they shut you down, that's not a law that's the problem. That's the fact that huge multinational corporations who are part of the establishment are shutting us down. That's a restriction of our freedom of speech, and you have to think to yourself, why are they doing that? There is an end game, and hopefully over the coming podcasts, we might be able to get into more of the discussion about where it is exactly that we're heading. Sadly, however, we're coming towards the end of our show today. We're going to try and keep these shows to 90 minutes. I guess if we could spend the next couple of minutes just discussing for our listeners at home what it is that you want to do with this podcast over the next few weeks and months, and where you see all this going.
Yeah, well, obviously, I want to. We obviously, Johnno and I, independently, are a part of the independent movement, the alternative movement, whatever you like to call it. With the Australian Roundtable, we want to create a community where people can come together, sit on the round table as guest panelists. We want to get guests in to speak about various issues. We want everyone that's on an independent sense doing fantastic work to have a hub where listeners and everything can come in to say, hey, there is a community that is trying to fight out against this, and there are individual people that are trying to fight out against all of these things that are threatening us as a sovereign nation or as sovereign people ourselves, just to create a community where we can speak about this and we can speak openly, and we can draw in people from the public to build a network where we can say, hey, here we all are, we're all coming together as a collaborative effort to try and fight some of this, because we need to, because we're no longer in a position where we can do this on our own. And that's some of my estimations or views of where this podcast I want to take the podcast with you, Johnno, and where we think this could go. I know you've got a couple of different thoughts maybe about where you think this could go.
Well, as you know, as we've discussed off the air, I think the fix is in, and essentially, in terms of stopping what's coming, I love the idea that we could. For me, what I'd love to see this podcast do, and other podcasts and other people's YouTube channels before they get shut down do, is just provide a place where, we look at that Gallup poll that said that 63% of Australians support bombing ISIS. Well, that means that there's 37% of people out there who are saying this is bullshit. And those people deserve some kind of representation in the media. Now, they're not going to get it in the mainstream media because, as you and I both know, it's completely corrupted. It's up to people like you and me and others to provide that platform. So hopefully with this show, until they shut us down, which might take weeks, it might take months, until that happens, we can provide a place where people can listen and know, hey, if you think this is all bullshit, you're not alone. A lot of people do, and we're going to try and provide a platform for people to discuss exactly these things. We'll get guests on the show. If you're making your own YouTube channels, if you're doing your own research and doing a good job, get in touch with us. We'd love to have you on the show. We can organise Google Hangouts like they do on the We'll Do It Live podcast with RPR and Free Radio Revolution. That's the kind of thing we want to foster because Australia needs it, especially in this city, Ethan, Brisbane, because as you know, in 5 or 6 weeks we have the G20 coming, and there are a lot of people in this city who are lovely people who want to see good things happen, who have no idea what's coming. And the mainstream media isn't going to tell them. They're probably not watching documentaries and YouTube videos from what happened in Toronto 4 years ago. If we can spread the message about what to expect to help them prepare, because a lot of people are completely unprepared for what's coming.
Yeah, no, it's gonna be interesting times, and each week on here, it's evident that we're gonna have a ton of information to talk about that we can't even fit into the 90-minute segment as we did today. But I think it's time to wrap up the pilot episode of the Australian Roundtable. Yeah, any final thoughts, Johnno?
Yeah, well, we'll make sure that next week we cover in greater detail the Ukraine issue and this Ebola thing that's crept up. The Georgia Guidestones will get a mention. They were on the agenda for today, but like you said, too much to get through. I want to thank you for coming in today for the pilot episode. I've really enjoyed this, and we'll be doing this every Sunday. I understand that next week the plan is to go live at 4 p.m. So for you listeners out there at home who want to tune in live, we'll be doing this on a Google Hangout. All the information will be on TOTT News, as well as on my website. We'll have all the links in the info box underneath this video. Tune in at 4 p.m. live Sunday next week for the Australian Roundtable Podcast. Ethan, thanks for coming. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Johnno.
Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
to the listeners.